Welcome to the latest MS Hear from the Experts webinar. These webinars help people better understand multiple sclerosis. We highlight MS-related resources, plus provide tools, tips to navigate their MS journey. We hope it brings you or your loved one more knowledge and confidence. Thank you for joining us for today's broadcast. My name is Gabrielle Vito. I've been a long-time volunteer with MS Canada since my own diagnosis back in 1996. I have relapsing remitting MS with the onset of fatigue, but I've been lucky enough to find an outlet for what energy I do have volunteering with MS Canada. So it's a real privilege for me to be here today to moderate today's broadcast and learn right alongside you. MS Canada would like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded and ancestral territory of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across Canada. These nations have cared for this land from the oceans to the mountain peaks for thousands of years and continue to do so today. We thank them for their continuous care and for the opportunity to host this session today. At MS Canada, we're committed to learning from and working with Indigenous peoples to care for the land we all call home. Now, before we get started with today's presentation, let's briefly go over a few housekeeping items. Your microphones have been muted. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box as soon as you think of it. There's no need to wait. We're going to get to as many questions as possible following today's presentation. Now, please note that questions pertaining to specific personal situations likely cannot be answered in this type of a venue. We recommend contacting your personal MS healthcare team, or perhaps you could contact one of our Knowledge Network navigators for your own personal situation questions. This session is being recorded and will be available soon on our website from the Informative Videos on MS page, and there will also be a Facebook Live recording. Now, please note that MS Canada does not approve, endorse, or recommend any specific product, therapy, or service, but instead we provide information to assist individuals in making their own health and wellness decisions. Now, plus the views and opinions expressed in this presentation today are those of the speaker and may not necessarily reflect the views or positions of MS Canada. Now, since 1948, we at MS Canada have been proud to be a part of the community of people living with MS. Their families, friends, plus volunteers, donors, researchers, clinicians, and many more. It's a big community. Together, we've helped fund research, provide information and support to people affected by MS, and we've taken a bold stance to advocate for changes that allow people living with MS to live full and inclusive lives. Our current strategic plan not only lays out the roadmap in our journey to create a world free of MS, but we hope it also provides inspiration for all in the MS community to connect and collaborate. So together we can advance treatment and care, enhance well-being, and understand and halt disease progression and prevent MS from ever happening in the first place. It's a big list, so we need everybody to pitch in. Please note that during this broadcast, a couple of pop-up polls will appear. We'd ask you to respond to each of them. The anonymous information will help MS Canada better understand your experience and the impact that we're hopefully having in the MS community. Now, for today's presentation, today's expert is Dr. Catherine LaRochelle. Since 2013, she's been a staff neurologist at the Centre Hospitalier de l'Université de Montréal, also known as CHUM. And since 2016, she's been a clinical assistant professor and a researcher at the CHUM Research Centre in the Neurosciences Department. Dr. LaRochelle's research team is interested by the impact of nutrition on neuroinflammation in the animal model of MS and in humans. Specifically, they're looking at how reducing the amount of certain amino acids in the diet could decrease inflammation, improve neurological symptoms, and potentially impact the disease course. This knowledge may help to identify new treatments for MS. So we're very happy she's here. Welcome, Dr. LaRochelle. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thanks to MS Canada for organizing this and also for funding our research and our bright PhD students. And today I'm really pleased to be here to talk about the neuroimmunology of diet in MS. So this is a subject I like very much. So I don't have any disclosure in relation to this talk. And we're going to start with a bit of an overview and then go a little bit about dietary patterns in MS. And then in the end, I'm going to show you some data that we generated with our research project. So first, I want to start just with a bold global statement. So the World Health Organization recognizes that unhealthy diet is one of the main driver of disease in the world. And in particular, as you might know, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, but also cancer. And as they state, other conditions linked to obesity. And among these, we need to recognize the fact that autoimmune diseases are promoted also by obesity. So why? The obese adipose tissue gets infiltrated by immune cells, and the immune cells in this obese adipose tissue gets very inflammatory and start to secrete pro-inflammatory cytokines and also hormones like leptin that are associated with more inflammation. And as you can see here, in fact, obesity is a risk factor for many diseases that are considered cousins of MS, so that they are considered to be mediated by inflammatory T cells such as Th17 cells. So you have rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, and inflammatory bowel disease. And you can see that obesity is linked to an increased risk, but also a more severe course and a decreased response to disease-modifying therapies. Now, if we look at MS itself, we know now for a couple of years that obesity during childhood and teenage years is more common among people with MS, so it does increase the risk of MS onset. But also we know that in kids with MS, obesity is associated with a response to first-line disease-modifying therapy that is not as good. And in adults with MS, we know that obesity is associated with accelerated atrophy of the optic nerve, for example, but also possibly of the cortex. So globally, it seems like obesity is a risk factor for both the onset and a more severe course. And of course, there is a lot of the risk of obesity that comes from genetics. And in fact, if you look at the genetic risk for a high body mass index, it's also associated with a higher risk for MS. So in addition to the genetic risk, which we cannot modify for obesity, of course, the other important risk factor is diet. And as you can see here, in recent years, there has been already an increase in the availability of calories and of high fructose corn syrup food and of ultra-processed food that is offered and easily taken and consumed. And now ultra-processed food represents 60% of total daily calorie intake in the US, which is kind of frightening. And as you can see here, it looks like the rate of obesity is also increasing as we see the availability of this ultra-processed food and also TV ads and publicity that is trying to get you to eat more of this food. So what is ultra-processed food? There are kind of categories that are called NOVA food groups. So if you talk about unprocessed or already minimally processed food, you would think of take an apple, wash it, and eat it. It's really like basic. You've done nothing with it. You have not transformed the product. If you look at minimally processed or processed but not ultra processed food, you would think, for example, of fresh bread from a bakery, olive oil, or like pasta that you can cook yourself. If you think about ultra-processed food, this is food that has been designed specifically to be highly palatable and to promote high consumption so that you will buy more. It has been designed, in fact, to sell. It usually contains additives that can be inflammatory. It's usually low in fibers, high in sugar, dense in calories, and it's highly palatable. So you want to eat more. So you think about like eating too much French fries or too much pizza is much more easy than eating too much fresh tomatoes, for example. Also, the thing with ultra processed food is that it keeps because there are additives and it's inexpensive. So unfortunately, it's usually more frequently consumed in people who have less time, less money, and have to rely on source of foods that are not close. So, for example, if you live 30 minutes distance from your grocery shop, it's not likely that you're going to be able to buy fresh food every day. So this does contribute to the obesity that we see right now. And just to show you a really interesting study that was done in the States. So they took healthy volunteers and they had them in for 4 weeks, and they provided every single item of food that they ate for 4 weeks. So for the first 2 weeks, they were presented with ultra-processed diet in half of the case, and the other half was presented with unprocessed diet, and then they switched after 2 weeks. And the two diets were perfectly matched for the calories, the sugar, the fat fiber. I'm sorry, there's a siren here. There's a police intervention. So they really had like their diets that were perfectly matched, and these are, of course, the same individuals. So they rated the ultra-processed diet and the unprocessed diet as equally pleasant and equally familiar. So then they should eat the same, right? But then when you look at the grams per minute, the ultra-processed food, you eat much more grams per minute because this is usually soft, easy to chew and palatable food. And it's also calorie dense. So you can see that the same people on the ultra-processed food diet ate many, many more calories per minute. And then it resulted in eating 500 calories per day more when they were on the ultra-processed food compared to the unprocessed food. So this is really frightening, and it has me thinking about what I'm buying, because as you can see here, even in just 2 weeks, you can see that the same person presented with ultra-processed food will gain 1 kilogram over 2 weeks, and the same person presented with unprocessed food will lose 1 kilogram over 2 weeks. So really, diet and obesity are linked, and there's a place where we can try to act. So this was just the indirect impact of diet through obesity on inflammation. But what is the evidence that diet in itself, outside of the obesity factor, can influence MS? And that's where we're going now. But here, I just forgot I had this place just to show you that it's not only humans that are susceptible to ultra-processed food. Even rats, to whom you present cafeteria diet, which is pieces of cookies, cheese, and processed meat or crackers, will gain weight much more than rats that are not shown that kind of food. So if we look directly at diet in MS, so what is the evidence that diet can change the onset of MS? So there's been a couple of studies, but one of the one that included the most participants was an association between Mediterranean diet and the risk of multiple sclerosis. And as you can see here, people who follow the Mediterranean diet had a lower risk of MS onset as compared to Western-style diet. So Western diet, of course, being higher in sugar, fat, processed food. And globally, there's been multiple studies showing that higher consumption of whole grain or yogurt, fruit and legumes, or dairy, fruit and vegetables. So depending on the studies, you can see that there are different patterns, but globally what would be called a healthy diet is associated with a lower probability of MS onset. And it's been replicated in multiple other cohorts. So you have a cohort from Australia, a cohort from Iran, and one from Southern Europe, all showing that if you have a higher quality diet, so more whole grain fruit, vegetables, unprocessed food, you have a lower risk of MS. And this is adjusted for smoking, obesity, socioeconomic status, etc. So it's really the impact of diet itself. Now, what is the impact on the activity of the disease? So again, you see that the higher quality of your diet is associated with lower disease activity on MRI, and that the more pro-inflammatory diet, which would be like high in saturated fat and processed food, will be associated with a higher risk of relapse and a higher risk of activity on MRI. And in kids, there was a really nice study in kids with MS where they've shown that if you have lower intake from fat and higher intake from vegetables, you have a lower risk of relapse. Even in kids, where you can say that there's nothing interfering, like the stress from your job or the fact that you're smoking or not. So it seems to be pretty robust that higher quality of diet is associated with lower risk of MS onset, and if you have MS, with lower risk of disease activity. Now, what about the impact on disability progression? So here is one of the best study, in my opinion. Again, it's Mediterranean diet, which is usually considered a very healthy diet. And here what you can see is you have the MS functional scale. So on top, the higher score, the more functional you are. So the MEDAS is the Mediterranean adherence score. So the higher your score, the more adherent to the Mediterranean diet you are. So you can see that you have a positive correlation. So if you have more adherence to this healthy diet, you have a better function. While on the bottom, you have the depression scale. So you can see that if you follow more closely the Mediterranean diet, you have a lower score of depression, so less depression. And this is also true when you look specifically at progressive MS, not just at relapsing MS, but progressive MS. You can see that your function is better if you are more adherent to the Mediterranean diet. And this was also seen in multiple other studies, as you can see here, in different groups, including also the Australian cohort and some other cohort across the world. So now we can say that MS onset course and disability progression is influenced by globally dietary or healthy dietary patterns. But what about the ultra-processed food? Because I spent a couple of minutes talking about this. So these studies are just coming. It's more recent, but as you can see here, it seems that if you eat more ultra-processed food, you have a higher risk of MS onset, and you also have a higher risk of a greater severity of your disease. These, of course, are smaller studies, but they are very well done and adjusted, again, for obesity, smoking, socioeconomic status, etc. So it seems like it's really the diet itself, not just the indirect link through obesity. So now that we've said that, what can we do? Is there any way to reverse that? What happens if we do dietary intervention in MS? So, of course, dietary interventions are always complicated in humans because when you change something in the diet, usually you change multiple things. You will change the calorie intake, the fat, the sugar, the ultra-processed. So it's hard to really pinpoint one thing. And also it's difficult in human because we all have pleasure usually in eating. We all have social events. So it's difficult to really adhere closely to a specific diet during a 6-month study, for example. But still, there are some groups that have done very nice studies. So you can show in small groups that low-fat diet seem to improve fatigue in MS in at least 2 different studies. And you can see here that any type of calorie restriction, which is, of course, a small calorie restriction, not like stop to eat, but really either time-restricted eating or either cycling between days with low calories and days with normal calories. You can see that any type of calorie restriction seems to be associated with enhanced well-being in people with MS. And here what you can see in a very, very well done study, it's a small group, but it's very well done. So what they've done is that they recruited participants with MS, and they assigned people either to the waiting group. So they were kind of waiting for the intervention for 6 months and just having the follow-up and everything. And they assigned the other half to Mediterranean diet intervention. And what you can see here is that the people who got assigned to Mediterranean diet, so they are the graph on the left, you can see that their fatigue score decreased a little bit over 6 months, while in the control group, it seems to increase a little bit. And same is true for the EDSS score, which is the disability score. So the higher, the worse. So you can see that it was either stable or a little bit decreasing in the intervention group, but it was, as expected, increasing a little bit over 6 months in the non-intervention group. So this seems to suggest that you can indeed improve at least some of the symptoms associated with MS through different types of dietary intervention. And here's also another one that was done in the States. So it's a ketogenic diet intervention. And here they were very closely supervised with the ketogenic diet to make sure that they had supplements for vitamin D, and did not develop a cholesterol problem. But here, as you can see, if you do the ketogenic diet for 6 months, you do improve your metabolic parameters. So you decrease your resistance to insulin. So you decrease your risk of diabetes. You also decrease the leptin, which is one of the hormones associated with the adipose tissue, and that is pro-inflammatory. And when you look at the scores for MS, you see that the quality of life, so both mental and physical, was increased for people on ketogenic diet, and the EDSS score and the depression index were reduced, so less depression and better function. So this is very encouraging. However, with the ketogenic diet, you have to be careful with the lipid profile because it tends to increase cholesterol. So what are the biological mechanisms that are implicated? Because that's something we're always interested in, to see how we can target these or how we can better address the problem. So the first question is, dietary intervention, is it what you eat or is it what you don't eat? So is it the fact that you add olive oil that is helping to reduce inflammation, or is it the fact that you avoid butter that is helping your diet? So same, is it because you remove ultra-processed food, or is it because you add fresh vegetables or fruits? So these questions are still pending. It's very hard to really isolate just one component of a healthy diet. And you have here a graph showing all the different types of diets that are usually recommended for different diseases. And you can see that for most, they will share the fact that you have very low intake of processed meat, very low intake of sugar, especially refined sugar. And globally, you will have lower caloric intake than in Western diet. Now, among the mechanisms that are implicated, we cannot go in details through all of which, but I highlighted some of the bigger mechanisms that I think are really interesting in MS. So one of the first things to realize is that when you eat, for example, if you decide to eat in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day, or if you eat from 7 a.m. to midnight, this will influence your circadian rhythm. So your gut has a circadian clock. And if you are feeding at different time of the day, this will change the circadian rhythm of your gut. That will in turn also influence your own fatigue, your own capacity to sleep or incapacity to sleep. And apparently changing the timing of your eating is one of the easiest way to reset your circadian clock. So this is one first thing. Another big mechanism is, of course, the metabolism. So if you eat, for example, something that is very high in sugar, you will immediately increase your secretion of insulin. This will change the metabolism of your body, so you will start to store energy instead of spending it. This will change the balance of your hormones, and this will, of course, at the cellular level, change what are the nutrients that are available to your cells. For example, if you're an immune cell, if you have lots of nutrients, it will be easier to replicate, proliferate, activate, and secrete inflammatory factors than if it's not that available. Also, it will change the expression of genes and the translation of proteins, which have, of course, a lot of impact on your immune cell, but also your CNS cells. Another thing that happens when you eat is what you eat is also what your gut bacteria are eating. So when you're feeding yourself, you're feeding your bacteria. And depending on what you eat, you will select different type of bacteria. So if you eat a lot of fibers, for example, you will promote what are usually considered anti-inflammatory gut bacteria that will degrade these fibers into, for example, short-chain fatty acids that are considered to be anti-inflammatory. And you will also globally influence the permeability of your gut intestinal barrier. So, of course, in your gut, you have bacteria that are in close contact with your intestinal wall, and you don't want bacteria to come too close or to go through this wall and then enter your body, because then you will have an inflammation of the immune cells that are residing in your gut. So the exchanges between the gut bacteria and the immune cells is extremely important, and it's important to educate your immune cells to be able to fight infection, but it might also at some point become too much and in fact promote inflammation. So both these nutrient availability and the gut bacteria will influence your immune status, and will, of course, influence also the status of your CNS cells, because you have what we call the gut-brain axis. And, of course, your brain is also relying on nutrient availability and also has immune cells that can get more or less inflammatory. So this is, of course, relatively complicated, but that's the thing with the nutrition. It influences so many processes, and it can help or harm. And here is a graph showing that to get things more complicated, it's a J curve for optimal immune responses when we talk about nutrition, which means that if you eat really too little, you're not going to be able to fight infection. You're not going to be able to have a good immune cell function. So this is bad. But if you eat too much, you will also not be able to fight correctly infection, and you will develop inflammatory responses. So you really have to try to reach this balance for the optimal immune responses, where you will have both a better capacity to fight infection and a lower risk of autoimmune diseases. So if we look at the animal models of MS, so the experimental autoimmune encephalomyelitis, so it's a mouse model where we basically vaccinate the mice with a myelin peptide, and then they develop an inflammatory reaction that is very similar to what we see in multiple sclerosis. And this is a score, so clinical curve for these mice. So the higher the score, the lower the function. So the mouse is getting more paralyzed if the score is higher. And as you can see in the graph here, if you do intermittent fasting, which is saying that you reduce the caloric intake 1 day out of 2 or 2 days per week, or every day, but just by a small amount, then you see that you decrease the severity of the disease for these mice, and you also see that you delay the onset of the symptoms. And on the right, you see that by another group doing the same type of intervention, they were able to show that if you do these fasting mimicking diet cycles, so which is you restrict calories 1 day out of 2, you will increase the good regulatory T cells, and you will decrease the pro-inflammatory bad Th17 cells, and this will also help the cells in the brain to repair the myelin and to have a better function. So this is one of the mechanisms, but also, as we said, with the gut. So as you probably know, there is gut dysbiosis associated with multiple sclerosis. So the gut microbiota is not exactly the same in people with MS and those without. And one of the best proof that we have of that is that if you take twins with MS, and the identical twin that doesn't have MS, and you give their stools to reconstitute the gut microbiota in mice that are susceptible to develop MS-like symptoms, you see that the mice that have received the feces from the twin with MS are much more likely to show MS symptoms than the one who received the feces from the twin without MS. So it's really implicated in inflammation and immune-mediated diseases. And in a really nice study, Claudia Cantoni has shown that in MS and controls in humans, if you eat more meat, you will increase the proportion of inflammatory bad Th17 cells, partly through changes in the gut microbiota, partly through changes in metabolism, but also directly the impact apparently of this diet. And this is also shown. Is also shown in other diseases. For example, using the ketogenic diet in epilepsy, you will also be able to decrease the bad pro-inflammatory Th17 cells and increase the nice Treg cells. And here in a small study in MS, they also showed that a high vegetable, low protein diet in MS was associated with a lower proportion of these pro-inflammatory cells. And here, another very recent and extremely nice study that was done in MS. So they recruited people with MS, and they were assigned either to a control unrestricted diet or an intermittent calorie restriction diet. And what they were able to see is that you have a little bit more naive T cells, which are usually considered as good anti-inflammatory T cells that are able to respond to new infection. You also had a bit more regulatory T cells, which are good, but what was even more striking is that if they did the SDMT test, which is a cognitive test in MS, they could show that over only 12 weeks, doing this intermittent calorie restriction improved this cognitive kind of working memory test for people with MS as compared to the control group. So this means that we can also have an impact on the CNS compartment with diet in MS. And is a very, very small study, but well done. This is 5 people per group. This, you can see that when they took 5 people with MS that they put on a Mediterranean diet intervention and compared to 5 equivalent people with MS that were put on a control diet, you can see that the ones that are on the control diet in red showed a decrease in the volume of cortex and thalamus, so more atrophy, while the ones that were put on the caloric restriction diet showed a stabilization or a bit of increased volume. So this is again promising to say that we might have a positive impact through diet on not only the immune cell compartment, but also the CNS compartment. And here, one aside before I show you some of our research data. So there's not only MS itself, there's also the risk of the disease-modifying therapies that we use for MS that we would like to impact with diet. And during COVID, we have unfortunately realized that obesity is not only associated with more inflammation, it's also associated with a reduced capacity to fight infection. So obesity was associated with a higher risk of death from COVID-19. But interestingly, diet itself, outside of obesity, so an increased consumption of sweetened beverages, decreased consumption of legumes, fruits, beans, or decreased adherence to Mediterranean diet was associated with a higher risk of mortality. And this is also true for the risk of cancer and of cardiometabolic diseases. You can see here that if you have a higher intake of ultra-processed food, if you have a higher intake of animal-based ultra-processed food, for example, pepperoni or packed meat, or if you have an increased intake of artificially or sugar-sweetened beverages, you have a higher risk of cancer and cardiometabolic comorbidities. So globally, other good reasons to try to change dietary patterns. And here, for the last slides, I wanted to show you a bit of data on our project, which is methionine restriction in neuroinflammation and is funded by MS Canada. So we and many other groups are interested in exploring feasible dietary interventions to dampen neuroinflammation in MS. And when we say feasible, we mean something that is still pleasant, still compatible with having dinners with friends and that you can follow every day. So one of the first intervention that was ever tried, not in MS specifically, in global health many years ago, it was caloric restriction. So this was used to increase lifespan from yeast to primates, and it's also associated with reduced cancers and reduced cardiometabolic diseases. However, it's very hard to do caloric restriction, and it's been studied in people with MS. It's really difficult to follow every day or 1 day out of 2 reduction of calorie intake. Despite support, it's very hard. So if you tried, you probably know it's difficult. We like to eat. It's fun to eat. It's difficult not to. So one of the best alternative is methionine restriction without caloric restriction. So methionine is an essential amino acid. It means that you cannot go to zero. You have a minimum that you need to have, but you don't need to have as much as what is provided by the Western diet. So methionine restriction without caloric restriction, it mimics the benefits of caloric restriction. So it means that it increases lifespan. It delays the apparition of age-related diseases, for example, diabetes type 2 or dyslipidemia. You can see here with the mice, on the 3 mice on the right that were on methionine restriction compared to the 3 mice on the left that were on control diet, that it slows aging. And same for the pictures below where you see the mouse on MR, methionine restriction looks less aged. And in fact, it does reverses some of the alterations that are associated with age in your DNA and your transcriptome. And it decreases globally inflammation. So MR is better tolerated than caloric restriction, and it's possible to apply to humans. Why? Because in fact, Western diet is the highest one in methionine. Any other type of diet will decrease your methionine intake. And in particular, you can look at Mediterranean diet, vegan diet, Japanese diet, ketogenic diet. It's all much lower intake of methionine. And why? Well, because most of the methionine is found in animal-based product, for example, in beef. You have some exception. For example, Brazil nuts are very high in methionine, while almonds are very low. But in the end, if you eat more vegetable, more fruits, more grains, you're going to eat less methionine. And what is also interesting about methionine is that it's converted to a S-adenosyl methionine, which is a universal donor for methylation of histone, which are implicated in expression of genes. So you won't change your DNA, you won't change your genes, but you might change how much you express a gene. And based on that, our collaborator, Dr. Russell Jones, started a project and worked with us to investigate if methionine restriction can improve neuroinflammation in MS and EAE. And here are my fantastic students who were all funded by MS Society and worked on this project. And first thing that Russell noted is that a T cell, so T cells are considered very important in MS, and it's activated T cells that mediate the damage. So he saw that if you compare an activated T cell with a naive T cell, you see that you have really an upregulation of methionine metabolism in the activated T cells. And he saw that if you restrict or if you lower the level of methionine in the culture medium of cells, of T cells, you will decrease their inflammatory profile. So you will decrease their capacity to express pro-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-17. And this is partly through the fact that you decrease the expression of the gene of IL-17. So this showed that methionine restriction can limit the expansion of the pro-inflammatory activated T cells in vitro. But then we wanted to see, is it true also in animals? So we use the same animal model that I described, where we vaccinate mice with myelin, and they show inflammatory lesion of the spinal cord and brain like we see in MS. And as you can see here, MR in red is associated with a very striking delay in the onset of the disease and also a milder disease in the animals that were put on the MR diet. And the diet is exactly the same for the control in the MR, except for the content of methionine. So there's absolutely no other difference, no difference in sugar, fat, or anything else. And when we look at the immune cells, you can see that the bad pro-inflammatory immune cells are reduced in the spleen. So it would be like the equivalent of what we can see in the blood of humans, and are also decreased in the brain and spinal cord of the mice that were put on this diet. So it does reduce neuroinflammation. And when we look at SNFL, you might have heard of this. This is now used in some clinics also to monitor the level of neuroaxonal injury due to inflammation in MS. So you can see that in these mice that were put on the methionine restriction diet, we had much lower level of SNFL, which is, we think, a kind of reflect of how much damage to neurons was happening. So this was really promising. And when we showed these results to a colleague who's a gut microbiota specialist, he said, for sure you have an impact on the gut microbiota. Let's have a look at it. And indeed, he saw that there are big differences. So here it might be a bit difficult to follow, but the difference is the farther apart the points are, the most difference there is. So you see on the left that our mice, before we put them on the different diet, they had really similar composition of gut microbiota. But then when we start them on the methionine restriction diet, their type of bacteria composition, so the communities of bacteria that are in their gut, become quite different from the control diet. So it seems that just limiting the amount of methionine that you take will influence your gut bacteria. And what we're doing right now is we're testing this in humans. So we started with healthy participants because we were not sure if we might aggravate MS symptoms by giving methionine to people with MS. So we wanted to start with healthy controls. So we're recruiting 20 men and 20 women that are people that are just on a normal Western diet regularly. And what we do is after the first 2 weeks, we switch them to a vegan diet, so a plant-based methionine reduction diet. And after 2 weeks for everyone on the vegan diet, then we start, and I'm sorry for the white square that is in the middle of the slide, but then for half of the group, they will receive methionine supplementation for 2 weeks and then switch to an identical placebo. And for the other half, they start with the placebo and then switch to 2 weeks of methionine supplementation. And then after this, they resume their usual Western diet. And what we do is every 2 weeks, we have a clinical visit where we look at fatigue, depression, anxiety, how they like the diet, how easy it was to follow it. And then we also take blood samples and stool samples. And the idea is, of course, to look at markers of inflammation, of gut inflammation, but also of immune inflammation, to see if we were able to reduce inflammation first with the vegan diet, and then if putting back methionine was kind of associated with more inflammation. And so far, we have already recruited 28 people. So we're very proud, and it's a very active study that is led by the team of my collaborator, Dr. Chantal Bémeur, who's a PhD nutritionist researcher. And here are the students, so Pierre Gliadel, Taima, and research coordinator Christelle and Clara, who are leading the study. And we were very pleased to see that we can decrease the methionine intake on average by 67% just by switching people from a Western diet to a vegan diet. And the reduction is so important that when we add back the methionine supplementation, we don't reach levels that are as high as the baseline level for most candidates. So this looks like it could be something that we could do also in people with MS without risking to deteriorate the disease. So globally, what I wanted you to show you today was that Western diet and related comorbidities can aggravate the course of MS by multiple mechanisms. There's just not one mechanism, and some are determined by genetics. And unfortunately, there's not much we can do, but some can be influenced by diet. And I wanted to say that a dietary intervention can impact neuroinflammatory processes in MS and its animal model, experimental autoimmune encephalitis. And I hope that I've convinced you that nutrition-related intervention must be approached scientifically and that we need much more research on that. And specifically, I think that we need research and biomarkers to individualize intervention. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all in dietary intervention for MS. For sure, like eating more fruits, vegetables, and whole grain and less processed food is good for everyone. But specifically, different components or different types of diet can be better for one, but not for the other. And there is a very good example in inflammatory bowel disease where they've shown that the particular type of fiber that you would find, for example, in artichokes. For most people with inflammatory bowel disease, if you eat it, it will help because you have bacteria that will convert it to anti-inflammatory metabolites, and it's super good. But for a small percentage of people who don't have the bacteria that are able to process these fibers, this is in fact deleterious. It will increase inflammation. So I think that we really need more research on that. We need also more research to see what is the impact on the CNS compartment. Can we boost remyelination? Can we decrease microglial activation with dietary intervention? And I think we need much more also intervention for the social and economic consideration. So it really takes time, money, and much more to be able to eat healthy. It's really difficult for someone who has low socioeconomic status, who has 2 jobs, monoparental, etc. It's really difficult to cook fresh food every meal. And we need also more research to see what's the difference between the diet itself and between different supplements or metabolic interventions. So that was what I wanted to show you today. And here is the team that is working very hard. So I'd like to thank all of my collaborators and students, and also the funding agencies, including, of course, MS Canada. So thank you.
Wow, wonderful. What an amazing presentation, Dr. La Rochelle. I mean, incredibly complicated, like everything with MS is, but it's very exciting to hear what you and your team are doing. And like you said, starting to unravel things step by step and approaching a diet scientifically. I want to get to some of the questions that folks have been typing in as you've been speaking. Thank you, everybody, for doing that. We'll get started. So, of course, you've referred to in your presentation a lot of the diets that are widely available. And, of course, we're all inundated with the advertising and the promotion for various different types of diets. So we have a few questions about different types of diets. So we'll start there. And I want to ask you about, you've mentioned the Mediterranean diet and the benefits of that. What are your thoughts, for instance, on the Walls protocol, if you're familiar with that one?
I'm familiar with that one. It's always difficult to say one is better than the other, or there hasn't been head-to-head comparison. From what I know, there is not someone who tried to say, let's say we're going to compare Mediterranean diet with the ketogenic diet and with Walls diet and see which one is better. I think, again, that's where we would need more biomarker, more studies, but also see what fits with your own lifestyle, with your own choices. If you have, for example, celiac disease, I'm not going to recommend the same thing that if you have, I don't know, another type of food allergy. So, and I think that within each diet, you can do good and bad things. So you can go overboard with ketogenic diet and then get dyslipidemia, bad cholesterol, or you can do very good things also with it. So I would say if you are interested by a particular diet, talk with a nutritionist, talk with your doctor, and try it, like see if it fits with you.
Great advice. That's fabulous advice. Now, next question, and I've heard about this, personally with a lot of people in the MS community. Does any of your research, or have you ever looked at gluten or dairy and its connection or effect on MS?
I have not personally, but there are studies, especially in kids with MS, there are studies suggesting that more dairy is associated with lower risk of MS, which might be counterintuitive because there is also, for some people, saying that it might increase. So from the studies I've seen in pediatric MS, for example, yogurt or low-fat milk seems to be associated with lower risk of MS. Again, any type of nutrition study is hard to compensate for every other confounding factors, because maybe if you eat more milk, it means that you live in that area, it means that you have that type of socioeconomic status. So it's always hard to determine. But there hasn't been a clear link between dairy and MS so far of what I'm aware. For gluten, if you have celiac disease, there are some common risk genes that are shared between celiac disease and MS. So it's also an immune-mediated disease. So if you do have celiac disease, you might have an increased risk of MS and vice versa. If you don't have celiac disease, there is no proof that eating less gluten will help MS. Again, it might depend on an individual basis. As I've shown you maybe it's not celiac disease that you have, but maybe it's certain type of fibers. Maybe it's not even gluten, but you have certain type of fibers that you don't feel good when you eat it because your bacteria are not the right ones. So I would say that there's no proof that eating gluten causes MS or worsen MS for most, but it might be for some.
Now, for when we're talking about protein, a lot of people depend on meat as a source of protein. A lot of people are suggested to eat meat as a source of protein. In any of your work, is there any evidence showing meats that are better than other meats when it comes to a source of protein?
That's a really good question. It's a really tough one also, because it gets extremely complicated, because even within meat, even within beef, you have beef that was grass-fed or not. you have like beef that was cooked or not, or which way it was cooked, with what kind of fat. So when do you eat it? So it can get quite complicated. So what I would say is usually most studies, if you don't look at EMET, but if you look at global health, usually they will say that poultry is possibly better than red meat. Then again, it might depend on the type of poultry. If you eat fried chicken, I don't think it's better than eating, of course, meat. There's also the alternative of saying, can you replace not all, but some of your animal-based protein by tofu, seitan, or nuts, or that's kind of also an approach to try. But yeah, from what we've seen, maybe fish and poultry usually are associated in some studies with maybe lower disease activity in MS or lower risk of MS. Whether I've never seen that red meat was associated with reduced.
Alrighty. Now, I have a question about people who are at the progressive stage of MS. But they've always had a healthy weight, so obesity itself hasn't been an issue. But for those sorts of individuals, could dietary changes have an effect on the disease progression rate?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's why I showed one of the studies in progressive MS specifically. Yes, it seems that even if you have progressive MS, even if you had disease for more than 14 years, and even if it's not true obesity, even if you adjust for obesity, you still get benefits from adhering to, for example, Mediterranean diet or any type of healthy diet. It's possibly through the fact that you lower your cardiovascular risk and cardiovascular comorbidities, which we know through the work of Ruth and Mary in Canada that are accelerating progression in MS if you have cardiovascular comorbidities. So even if you don't reach the diabetes stage, if you lower your insulin resistance, it will still help probably. So yes, I would say that for anyone, it might help. Of course, you might already be doing everything perfectly. It's not perfect. Some people have eaten all their life perfectly and still have MS. It's certainly neither necessary nor sufficient, but it might help.
Right. It's one piece of the puzzle, not all of it. Yeah. Now we have a question here again, or another one asking about why did you choose a vegan diet study and not a vegetarian diet?
Great question. That's because we really wanted to lower a lot. Like we wanted to radically reduce the level of methionine, and you still have methionine in cheese and eggs because these are also animal-based products. So it's a bit higher. So you could lower, if you choose vegetarian over Western, for sure you're going to decrease your methionine intake, but not as much as with a vegan diet.
Gotcha. All right. Makes sense. All right, and the only other thing, we have two more coming in here. Here we go. Could you comment, doctor, on which seems to be more impactful, diet modification versus caloric reduction, i.e. periodic fasting? I mean, you've touched on this, but could you touch on that again?
So it seems that it's working also quite well, the intermittent fasting or the time-restricted eating for the studies that have been done. Again, if you can do good and bad things with that. If you do too much caloric restriction, you might put stress on your cells and your gut and everything. While if you do it just a little bit, just as is recommended, you can decrease inflammation. So then again, it also depends on how it fits with you. And I think we need more studies to say, is it time-restricted eating, or is it like fast mimicking cycle, or is it like methionine restriction? I think that all of these interventions are good and might fit better for one person or the other, depending on what. But yes, it's been tested, and there are studies ongoing also for the intermittent fasting and for the time-restricted eating.
Wonderful. All right, let me go through my list here and see. I think we've pretty much covered. Oh, there was one other example. Oh, two more questions. Again, this has to do with dieting. The autoimmune protocol AIP diet. Are you at all familiar with that one?
I've heard about it. I would have to double check to see what the...
Yeah, it's not one that I'm familiar with.
Dairy and gluten in addition to ultra-processed food, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So
And then the only other question about diet we have here is Ozempic. I know it's very popular lately, and people with MS as well as the general population. Is there any information on how Ozempic affects MS?
Not yet. There are studies ongoing, and like the what is not Ozempic but is still something in this area is metformin, which is right now I think the study is finishing in pediatric MS in Canada. So tested to reduce the disease activity. So I think it's expected that the fact that you will reduce the insulin resistance and diabetes and that you will indirectly probably improve MS, but it has not been proven yet. And I think that even if you take Ozempic, it does not replace or cancel the benefits that you could get from eating more healthy. So I think it's globally, I think we can say that eating less processed food, less sugar food, less sweetened beverages, you cannot go wrong with doing that. And eating more vegetables and fruits, I think it's a very safe recommendation for everyone. And I think that even if you take Ozempic, it's worth it to try to implement a healthy diet. But these studies are ongoing. Certainly, there's an interest for that for sure.
Well, that's wonderful to hear that there are studies ongoing, and I think it's really practical advice that you're giving. I mean, way back in 1996, when I was diagnosed, one of the first things my neurologist said was, you need to eat more rabbit food. So that hasn't changed, obviously, over the years, and it's even more important now than it was back then. So I want to thank you, Dr. La Rochelle, for being with us today. That has just been a fabulous presentation. You've given us lots to think about, lots to chew on, if you will. And I like your recommendation that folks, if you can, get a referral to a nutritionist and work with them to find out what works best for you, because any change you can make along a healthy line will have an impact. That's great to know. So thank you very, very much. That's the end of our time for questions. Dr. La Rochelle, we thank you for your time and your presentation. Now, I'm going to just have a couple of closing slides to share with you all before we end today's webinar. As we wrap up today's broadcast, we want to remind you about how you can connect with the MS Knowledge Network. It's staffed by trained volunteers, they're called navigators, and they will provide consistent quality information and support. You can connect by phone, email, or live chat through the MS Canada website. These staffers are available Monday to Friday from 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening Eastern Time, and they can provide assistance in both English and French. We also want to encourage you to be a part of the MS community and encourage you to get involved with our programs and our services, our events. We have government relations programs and lots of different volunteer opportunities. I know I've had a lot of them over the years, and it really does have an impact on my connection to MS and my connection to the MS community. Together, we can take action to create a future free of MS. To find out how you can take that action, you can check out the website again, mscanada.ca. Now, I also have an announcement to share with you all today, one that MS Canada is very happy to share. They're so pleased to announce that there is a new page on the website specifically related to nutrition and MS information. It's got animated videos, a blog. It's a deep dive into the powerful connection between nutrition and MS, just like we've been hearing about today. From colorful veggies to healthy fats, discover how small changes on your plate could make a big difference in how you feel. Watch, read, and get inspired. Again, you can go to mscanada.ca and search nutrition to be taken to the new page, and that new page is called Nutrition and MS. So to connect with us, our last slide of the day will give you some information on that. You can connect via email or directly through the website. If you have questions about education activities, please reach out directly to the education team. You can see the email there. It's education@mscanada.ca. And again, for all information, the website is mscanada.ca. And you can search there or click on the live chat to get help immediately with what you are looking for. Well, that wraps things up for today. So on behalf of MS Canada, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. I want to wish you a wonderful evening, day, wherever you're joining us from. Thanks so much for being here. Take good care of yourselves. Bye-bye.